So I'm going to give it a second for folks to trickle in, but hope you all are doing well. Hope that you've been enjoying these afternoon and evening storms that we've been getting. I know I definitely have. It's been super refreshing to get rain. I also just like thunderstorms, so it's been fun to take a look at. Also, now that I'm saying it out loud, I feel like I need better small talk prompts than weather. It's just so basic, but here we are. Especially given that you all can't respond. It's not like we can have a conversation about the weather. I'm just, giving my opinions, but cool. I think that we have a good enough group to get us started. Thank you all so much for making time to come out tonight. Hopefully we have some familiar faces on from the last meeting we had back in July. For those of you that weren't able to attend that meeting, we'll do a quick round of introductions just so we can be familiar. I'll start. I'm Tanner Simeon Cox, he, him pronouns, and I am the Colorado Program Director with SUN. And I will pass it over to Jasmine next.
Hi everyone, I'm Jasmine. I am the Community Impact Specialist for Colorado, so I work with the volunteers.
And I'm Emma Searson. I'm SUN's Policy and Advocacy Campaigner for Colorado, so I support all of the advocacy work that we do across the state.
I'm fighting back a little bit of a sneeze, so I'll apologize if I have to go off mute. But thank you all for the intros, and just to echo what Emma put in the chat, would love to see you all introduce yourself in the chat as we go along. A fun prompt that we've been doing. So neither Emma or Jasmine are in Colorado. They're joining us from different parts of the country. What I like to do whenever we have people from other parts of the country join is for all of us Coloradans to put our name and the elevation that we're at in the chat. It's always a fun little thing to do. I'm in Colorado Springs, so I'm at about 6,800 feet where I am. If you're able to do the same, definitely feel free to do so. While you all do that, we're going to get started with the presentation tonight. Gonna give a little bit of a recap of who we are as SUN, and some of the conversation we had back in July, just to get everybody up to speed. And then after that, what we really want to focus on tonight is mainly two things. We want to look at the history of net metering in Colorado, sort of where it's come over the past 25 or so years. And we also want to look a little bit into why utilities are interested in changing net metering in the first place. The argument that they use that we're going to explore later is called the cost shift, but I will save the details for once we're actually into it. So for those of you that may not be familiar with SUN, we are a national vendor neutral nonprofit. That vendor neutrality piece is what I really like to highlight. So we are impartial whenever it comes to any type of provider, be it utility district or solar company or financing option. What we really aim to do is provide a neutral perspective so our members can make the most well-informed decision that makes sense for them and their household. We go about our work in three ways. That's really our theory of change, right? So the first piece of that is that we help folks go solar. That can be either from one-on-one consultations to our co-ops to Solar Switch, which is a new program we're running in the Denver area. And then the second piece is that we like to join together. Could be a night like tonight where we meet up and talk about a policy issue or just general educational material, or it could be something exciting like going and hanging out at a brewery to celebrate new solar installations. And then all of that really coalesces in the third piece of our theory for change, which is fighting for energy rights. And that's really the primary topic of tonight's discussion, right? As we know that something is happening in net meter or in Colorado around net metering, and we want to figure out what it is, what it means, and how we can be involved. So moving on down a few slides here, I want to talk about what we're going to be covering today. Give the slides a second to catch up. So to start here in a second, I want to provide some general updates on what we know about what's happening with net metering in Colorado. Then we're going to take a look at the history of net metering. I want to just give like a preemptive word of warning. We're going to go over some like key terms and definitions here in a little bit. We're going to be looking at a number of different bills and amendments and policy recommendations and so on and so forth throughout tonight's call. So if that is not your wheelhouse, if that's not something you're super comfortable in, just want to like, don't worry. Like, we've broken this down. We're here to answer questions. We're going to walk through this together. That way, whether you feel like an expert now or not, we can all take that next step forward in feeling more confident with the issues at hand. And finally, we're going to take a look at the cost shift argument that I mentioned earlier. So first, to get into some updates here, on the next slide, we know that as we mentioned in July, there was a group of key stakeholders that the Colorado Energy Office had convened to talk about the future of net metering in Colorado. These groups ranged from utilities to utility associations, to solar industry groups, pro-solar nonprofits, as well as some equity-focused community-based organizations. Since our call in July, these deliberations have ended, and we're expecting sort of an imminent proposal to come out of the Colorado Energy Office in the next few weeks. We're still in a place where we're not certain as to what that proposal is going to look like, but we're gearing up and we're ready to respond to it whenever it does, regardless of how it looks. The best information that we have been given is a general sometime around Labor Day is when we're expecting to see this news. Don't have a specific date or time frame, but we will be able to update all of our membership whenever that does happen. What we're expecting to come out of this proposal is most likely going to be legislation in 2025. While we're not completely ignoring the possibility of a more immediate change, that is just not the expectation right now. Based on everything that we've heard and everything that we've collected, we're most likely expecting this to be a legislative issue in 2025. So that is sort of how things are looking right now. And that builds off some of the discussion we had in July whenever we had our friends from Green Latinos and Vote Solar join to talk a little bit about how those discussions had looked at the Colorado Energy Office. To recap a little more of our last conversation, just to set us up well for tonight, we really spoke primarily about what net metering is and how it is beneficial. So if you remember from our last call, we talked about net metering as a fair crediting system or a fair crediting policy that allows solar owners to receive a fair credit for the excess electricity that they produce in a given time frame. And we talked about how those credits are able to roll over into consecutive months. That way you're able to offset your electricity bill whenever your system may not be producing as efficiently as it would on like a perfect summer day. So with that brief recap, I want to talk a little bit about the history of NEM in Colorado. Before we do that though, I'm going to lay out some key terms and definitions that we're going to kind of be using on repeat throughout the presentation. So on the next slide, you can see that first one is net metering, just recapped it. It is the crediting system that allows customers to be credited for the excess electricity they generate from their solar system at a one-to-one retail value. Similarly, virtual net metering is an important policy that is designed, the best frame of reference we can sort of bring for this is community solar. So imagining that you're buying a share of a community solar garden, you are credited through virtual net metering for the electricity that share produces that is then able to help offset your bill in the future. REC, so wanted to just throw these up here because we're going to be using a lot of acronyms, or else I'm going to get tongue-tied more than I already do. RECs stands for Rural Electric Co-ops. Those are utilities like Grand Valley Power, Yampa Valley Electric, Holy Cross Energy. Those are nonprofit entities that are led by their membership. So they have open elections to elect the board. And they are utility districts that operate in different areas throughout Colorado. IOUs, whenever we refer to IOUs, those are investor-owned utilities. The two in Colorado are Excel Energy and Black Hills Energy. Those are sort of the larger utilities that are going to cover most of the state. Whenever I say munis, I'm just referring to municipal-owned utilities. So I saw somebody else's from Colorado Springs. We have CSU, Colorado Springs Utilities, is our municipal utility. Longmont Power, Fort Collins, these different towns may have municipally owned utilities. And then finally, whenever I say PUC, I'm referring to the Public Utilities Commission. There are going to be a few that I mentioned in the future that are going to have a slightly different name, like Public Services Department. But for our conversation, they're equal as far as their roles and responsibilities in a given state. So now that we have our terms and definitions under our belt, you'll have to forgive me. I was a high school teacher once, and I always made my class do an imaginary seatbelt whenever we were about to buckle up for a long journey. So you're off camera right now. We can't see you. If you feel like doing the imaginary seatbelt, please do, but don't feel like you have to. But we're going to be talking sort of at length about where net metering has come from in Colorado and where it's looking like it's going to go. So with the history of net metering, we really have to get our start in the late 90s. So in the late 90s, investor-owned utilities began to do some small net metering projects, and small here refers to less than 10 kilowatts, through a rulemaking procedure at the PUC that was really designed to encourage more renewable adoption. Around the same time, Holy Cross Energy and Glenwood Springs began sort of a pilot project around net metering that didn't have any specific caps on system size, but the pilot project as a whole was capped to 50 kilowatts of total installed capacity, and they wouldn't net meter anything above that 50 kilowatts total. In 1997 is when we had really our first sort of public dialogue around net metering and what net metering could look like at a state level. And this happened with the introduction of House Bill 97-1305. This was the first bill really aimed at requiring all utilities to provide net metering for systems up to 25 kilowatts. This bill did die in committee, but it really set the tone for the direction that net metering would take in the 2000s. So as we got into the early 2000s, in 2002, there was House Bill 02-1415 that was introduced. And this was primarily focused on the RECs, the rural electric co-ops, and required that they establish net metering programs, but they placed the cost of equipment installation, like the bidirectional meters, on the customer. This bill also limited the total number of net metered customer capacity to 1% of the utility's monthly peak demand. And the credit value is set to be not less than the REC's avoided cost. This bill also established the carryover principle for excess generation, and excess credits that accumulated throughout the entire year were paid out to the customer in the true-up period at the end of the year. In 2004, we had Amendment 37, which was the first renewable energy standard in the country that was passed by public initiative. I'm just going to read a quote from that amendment really quick. So the amendment stated that it will allow customers' retail electric consumption to be offset by the solar electricity generated. To the extent that solar generation exceeds the customer's consumption during the billing month, such excess generation or energy shall be carried forward as a credit to the following month's consumption. To the extent that solar electric generation exceeds the customer's consumption during a calendar year, the customer shall be reimbursed by the qualifying retail utility at its average hourly incremental cost of electricity supply over the prior 12-month period. So a lot of words, but it was really the first statewide initiative to pass a net metering rule that was universally applicable. Then in 2008, we graduated to House Bill 08-1160, which really established most of sort of what we currently have for RECs, such as the 10 kilowatt cap for residential installations and the 25 kilowatt cap for commercial installations, as well as the net excess generation credits and the rollover that we've already talked about a bit. This particular bill lacked a service charge, but it was the first sort of public mention of a cost shift that we were able to dig up in all of this. So we'll return to the cost shift in a minute, but want to quickly name that today we're looking, as of 2019, investor-owned utilities have a rule that you're allowed to size your system that will be net metered up to 200% of your annual electricity consumption. And as I just mentioned, RECs and unis are at 10 kilowatt residential and 25 kilowatt commercial caps. So that is really, really quick summary of where we have come from with net metering and sort of the evolution of the policy in Colorado history. And now I think it's important that we take a look at why utilities are interested in changing this and sort of what they have to say. Which brings us to our next section, which is addressing the cost shift. So utilities claim that solar owners cause at least two undue burdens. First, they claim that solar owners do not pay an adequate share compared to retail customers in order to maintain the grid. And second, they claim that solar owners shift that cost of grid maintenance and other fixed utility expenses to lower income working families and renters. This is one of the reference points that I'm going to be using throughout our discussion is a white paper study that was published last year by the Colorado Rural Electric Association. CREA is sort of the statewide trade association for the rural electric co-ops. And they published this paper in response to some changes that RECs were proposing to net metering in their utility districts. This is a very recent example of the argument around the cost shift, but this narrative dates back quite a while, and I think it was the Edison Electric Institute, which is sort of a think tank for utility groups that really started this narrative. But for our conversation, I do think it's most helpful if we focus in on the CREA paper. In the paper, they really reiterate these 2 points that are on the screen right now, that solar owners don't pay enough in order to maintain the grid, and that sort of decrease in payment shifts the cost to other customers. In the paper, they even take it one step further, which I found super interesting. And their argument was that solar owners it's not just that they don't pay enough, but they're actually paid to use the grid. Whenever I sort of read that sentence, I was like, okay, like, where is this coming from? What is your argument? And as I read on, they started to talk about how utilities figure grid maintenance costs into their rate design, as opposed to having sort of multiple fixed charges for maintenance, transmission, other things like that. They go on to say in the paper that because a solar owner presumably receives net metered credits based on the retail rate of electricity, that solar customer is not only being paid for their generation, but also for the maintenance costs figured into the rate design. So this argument seems plausible, right? Like reading that at face value, it makes sense. Like I understand the argument, I understand the direction they're going. But one thing that I really value in studies like this is to see concrete data, to be able to see the numbers and the reference points whenever claims like this are made. And unfortunately, I didn't find that data in the study, nor in many other similar studies that have been conducted by utilities. So I'm a skeptic at heart, and whenever we look at these things, it is, it's a pretty easy line to see this argument and to have the understanding, right, that utilities, their goal is to really protect their bottom line. Like they are really concerned about their revenue year over year. And the more solar owners they have, there will be a natural decrease in that revenue, in that profit. And I think what's most helpful for us and what was most helpful for me is really looking at a variety of studies that do have the numbers, that have the reference points that we can pick apart and understand. And I will say, as we move on to this next slide that looks at some of these studies, if you're sort of nerdy like I am and you want to dig into some of these on your own, all of the studies, the primary sources, secondary sources that I'm mentioning tonight are going to be linked in this presentation, so you'll be able to sort of access them. So again, buckle up metaphor, do whatever. We have a slew of different studies that have been conducted over the past handful of years that I would like to take a look at with you all tonight. The first one, like I mentioned, Public Services Department, same operational sort of function as a Public Utilities Commission. But the Vermont Public Service Department commissioned a study in 2013 that looked at the value of solar. One specific quote that came out of their study is that net metered systems do not impose a significant net cost to ratepayers who are not net metering participants. So this is sort of a really critical point where we had an independent study done by a state department that found that net metered customers are not imposing significant net costs onto non-net metered ratepayers. But again, that does not have like a concrete data point. So let's move on to the next one. In 2014, Nevada's PUC did its own study, and they found that net metering as a program, as a policy, as a credit system provided approximately $36 million in benefits to all Nevada energy customers, proving that solar with net metering is beneficial to everyone, not just solar owners. Moving on down the line, in 2014, same year, Minnesota's PUC did another study, and they found that the value of solar, this is getting a little more into brass tacks, we're getting more specific. They found, this is a direct quote, the PUC found that the value of solar was 14.5 cents per kilowatt hour, which was 3 to 3.5 cents more per kilowatt than Xcel's retail rates. They factored this in with other sort of things like the social cost of carbon, the avoided construction of new power stations, so on and so forth. But they found that not only was net metering not causing a cost shift onto non-solar customers, but that the value of solar, what solar added to the state's electric system, to the grid, was actually worth more than the retail rate of net metering in the state. Similarly, in 2015, the Maine PUC commissioned another value of solar study to determine the full costs and benefits of increasing solar adoption. So this was more focused on how do we encourage more solar adoption in a way that makes sense. Their study incorporated figures ranging from avoided energy costs and the cost of integrating more solar to avoided environmental costs and health impacts and all of those sorts of things. Their work found that solar was in fact worth more than the retail value of net metering. To give another quote, they put a value of 33 cents per kilowatt hour on energy generated by distributed solar compared to the average retail price of 13 cents per kilowatt hour, the rate at which electricity is sold to residential customers, as well as the rate at which distributed solar is compensated. So again, we have another case in point between Minnesota and Maine, where that value of solar was actually demonstrated to be more than the retail rate of net metering. So those examples were up to 2015. That's still 9 years ago. Let's dig in a little more to a couple of more recent examples. So in California in 2020, there was a testimony that was given before the California PUC in response to basically what was like a net metering 2.0 plan. In the study, the authors' focus was more narrow, right? They weren't factoring in these environmental and health impacts and so on and so forth. They focused primarily on the decreased demand for new transmission lines through the increase of solar adoption. So interested to see what they found, and they shared that these avoided costs alone, just the avoided costs of decreasing demand for new transmission lines, were worth more than the retail value of net metering. Then finally, in 2024, so this year, Maine PUC issued another sort of study on the issue. And this came out of a law that was passed last year that required the PUC to issue an annual report that really accounted for the costs and benefits of the state's solar development. The graph that you have on your screen is actually pulled from that study, so you can take a look there. And they found that the cost of implementing what they call their net energy benefits program, which again, pulling back the terms and definitions, is a combination of net metering and virtual net metering. The cost of that, of implementing that program, was $99.37 million, while the benefits it provided were $127.82 million. So again, we have a significant sort of delta there between the cost and the benefits that were provided that is really concrete. As a summary of all of these studies, we can see sort of from different parts of the country at different times, red states, blue states, regardless of where it is, these studies demonstrate that even with varying metrics that were used, varying guardrails that were used for these studies, net metering was shown to not have any adverse or cost shifting effects. And even sometimes, like we showed, it proved that the value of solar was actually more than the retail net metered rate. So that was all very interesting to me. And that sort of gave the, those concrete data points, the numbers that we were looking for whenever we're evaluating these issues. And it's something that, we believe that lawmakers and regulators should really have top of mind whenever they're adopting new policies or considering new policies. One thing that I do want to make clear is that the situation in Colorado is going to look different than these other states. But we really believe that no decision should be made until we have established what this value of solar is, right? Like, we shouldn't move away from something that is working until we have determined the actual impact of doing so. So moving away from the numbers a little bit here in these studies, what we've learned is that net metering really enables increased solar adoption, which leads to these things that you can see on the screen. So we know that it lowers electricity cost for solar adapters. That's obvious in the case of rooftop, and even for community solar, we approximate folks that subscribe to a community solar program will see an average of around 10% bill savings, which is significant if you're, a working family that needs that extra, that money month to month. That's an important factor. We also know that it leads to healthier communities, especially in areas who have been, fossil fuel dependent. As they begin to transition to solar and other renewables, this leads to a decrease in the negative health impacts in a particular area. We know that increases grid resilience and decreases natural disasters like wildfires caused by downed power lines. We also know that it leads to a pretty substantial increase in job creation. A data point that I like to share, if you've been to one of our like regular Solar 101 calls, you may have heard us mention this before. But we actually at Sun keep track of how many solar jobs are created through our programs. And I pulled up the figures before this call, and in Colorado since 2019, just our programs alone have led to the creation of over 130 new solar jobs, which is super exciting. I'm sorry I was like very monotone while saying super exciting, but it is super exciting, and we're stoked that we get to keep track of those numbers and really see the impact as we work with installers and get to see their companies grow and get to see people move into different job fields. This is a really critical piece of maintaining net metering, is maintaining that job growth and maintaining a healthy economy. And then finally, we know that net metering is really a catalyst for solar adoption in marginalized communities and low-income communities. This is true for virtual net metering for folks that may be renters, but it's also true for working families that own their home, especially as we see an increase of funding through the Inflation Reduction Act for solar incentives for low-income families. We see this at the local level. We see this through city rebates, utility rebates. We're at a critical moment now where communities who have historically been left out of the energy transition have the opportunity to join in, and net metering is a key piece of that. And then finally, the Department of Energy has actually reported that they've noted an increase in LMI solar adoption in states with full retail net metering. So again, another key point for arguing to protect it as a credit system. Want to close this section by talking a little bit more. Actually, we can just go, this is fine. We can keep it on this slide. Want to talk a little bit about cost shifts that utilities don't mention, right? Because it's important whenever we're bringing up this argument or this discussion conversation to realize that the electric system, right, is full of shifting costs. Like it is something that we do know and that we can state, and we have to look at and understand in order to understand why this argument is being used in the context of net metering. But as I mentioned, electric system is full of shifting costs, and they're not all a bad thing. A really good example of this is that like rural electrification is a wonderful thing, but more often than not, it is more expensive to provide power to rural communities than it is for densely populated areas. So does Excel charge someone in Alamosa County, let's say, more than a Denverite to make up for this cost? They don't. And again, this is not a bad thing at all, but it's an example of how we don't actually base people's electric bills on the exact cost of serving that individual, because it wouldn't be fair or reasonable to do so. And then finally, there is a real cost that families near fossil fuel plants have to pay. A Harvard School of Public Health study found that coal power inflicts between 1/3 to roughly $500 billion of external costs on the US every year. And this comes in the forms of water contamination, air pollution, public health impacts, so on and so forth. And these communities that are facing the brunt of this are often working communities and communities of color. And they really bear the frontline cost of that fossil fuel generation and receive no compensation or reward in exchange for that disproportionate burden. So cost shifts are real. but we do not base, we don't base folks' electric bills on those cost shifts because it's not a fair approach to this. To do a little recap, want to really say that I appreciate you all for working through this with us tonight. I know it's sort of been rapid fire, a lot of information, but all of this is really critical to understanding, one, in a fair way, why it is that utilities are interested in changing net metering as a policy. And then two, to actually look at the numbers that exist that have been issued in studies that show why net metering is an overall benefit. To recap what we've talked about, we know that net metering has a vibrant history in Colorado. It's a policy that has worked to provide a fair credit for the excess generation solar owners send back to the grid. We know that utilities propose that net metering causes at least two unfair burdens. First, they claim solar owners do not pay an adequate share compared to retail customers in order to maintain the grid. They also claim that solar owners shift that cost, typically to lower income and working families. And then finally, multiple studies, including the 6 cited here tonight, clearly demonstrated that net metering does not cause an undue cost shift, but instead operates as a fair credit for solar owners. You all are going to receive, I've already mentioned this, I think, but in the follow-up email you get, you should receive a copy of this presentation. Feel free to dig in on the final slide to the works that we reference. That way you can take a look. Some of it's a lot to digest, but we definitely recommend as you're comfortable digging into those. Yeah, I want to move us to questions and answers here in just a second. But as always, I have some requests of you all before we do that. Would love if you all were able to fill out the volunteer survey that we've created. This is just an easy way for us to connect with you all, to assess sort of if you're feeling up to speed on the things that we're discussing. It's a chance for you to provide feedback on things that you would like to learn in these spaces, and also let us know if there are specific ways you'd like to be involved with us. Second, as you can see this beautiful little screenshot to the side here, we have a petition that we're actually launching tonight, which we are super excited about. We are building off of an action we did sort of over the past year to Governor Polis, and we're working on circulating this petition that really focuses on protecting net metering as a fair crediting system for Coloradans. Would love if you all are able to take a quick second, read through it, add your name, and then if you're like a real go-getter, be so helpful if you shared this like 3 or 4 friends or family members. We're in the business of collecting as many signatures as we can, and as much as you're able to help us with that, it will be greatly appreciated. And then finally, in the follow-up email you receive tomorrow, you will get a link to register for the September iteration of this meeting. Would love to see you all again. Think we've been having really good discussions and would love if you are able to make it out. So with that, appreciate you all. Next slide here is our team contact information. If you want to reach out, we can take the next few minutes here for questions and answers. But if we happen to end the night early, then I'm sure nobody would be upset about that. So feel free to chime in the chat with any questions you have, and me and the team can dig into those. Thank you all. That is a good question. Brian, so the access charge is just it's the service charge that you receive on your bills in order to have access to the grid in case your solar system is down. So this is sort of standardized and neutralized across all utilities, and it does factor into that aspect of, I misspoke, it's not standardized across all utilities. All utilities have an access charge, but they vary depending on where they are. But that is to be used, like if your system isn't working, you're still able to have power by tapping into the grid. And that does factor some into the cost shift argument, but it is not something that is super substantive whenever it comes to that. I don't know, Emma, if you have anything else you would add there. So Jana, thank you for the question. I'm going to work backwards. What kinds of things do you think the Polis committee will recommend? We're not certain at this point. There have basically been a number of proposals that have kind of come and gone at that table, and I am not I don't have a ton of liberty to talk about those in depth at the moment, but we know that there have been really pro-solar groups that have submitted their proposals to the Energy Office and basically said, hey, these are our red lines. This is what we absolutely need to see in order for there to be any negotiations at all. And we have seen the reverse from other groups where it's basically, hey, this is the roadmap for actually changing net metering. While, like I said, I can't get into the specifics of that a ton, we are, as soon as the proposal is released, we will be like sort of broadly circulating and commenting on how that's looking. And then 2 public interest groups in favor of siding with utility and Polis to eliminate net metering. Please explain their justification. I like to be as fair as I possibly can in these situations because there are tons and tons of great people and organizations that are working on this issue. And just because we don't see eye to eye doesn't mean that they're coming from the worst place possible. I think a lot of folks are really concerned about their communities. Like they want to represent their membership well. And if their membership is comprised of working families or lower income communities, then they could see solar as an actual cost shift. And oftentimes that can come from a place of just not having a full dialogue like this, where we're digging into the details. Another element of that is sort of the question around the fastest way to decarbonize, whether it's at the utility scale or at the residential level. And some folks are fully supportive of doing the most they can to make that transition as quick as possible at the utility scale, which again, we understand that argument. Like we understand where folks are coming from if they're very climate or environmentally minded. But what we don't want to do is create the same system of utilities taking advantage of ratepayers just with clean energy now. We want to make sure that we're creating a true energy democracy where folks are able to produce and own the power that they create. And we think that that's an element that can't get left behind while we're having these conversations. For the utilities at the table, protecting their bottom line mostly, but I like to be fair to everybody. So Emma or Jasmine, do you have anything to add there?
I think you said it beautifully.
I don't think anybody inherently wants to eliminate rooftop solar. And I don't think the trajectory that we're looking at right now is going to be like a cliff where net metering just suddenly is gone. I don't, Emma, definitely go ahead and add to that.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt your sentence. I was, yes to that. And I think maybe part of the confusion is that a lot of folks use the term net metering to mean any sort of compensation or credit that solar owners receive for their extra power, whereas we use net metering to very specifically mean one-to-one credits, like where you are receiving credit for the exact retail rate that you're paying for power. So if we say that they're getting rid of net metering, that's what we mean they might be getting rid of, not that there would be no credits whatsoever. They might be reduced, there might be something gradual, like Tanner's saying, we're not expecting a cliff, but there could still be changes that would be harmful to solar adoption.
And then Dwayne, that's a good question. And I think that would require some more digging than what we have time for tonight. You can email the email address that we put in the chat here and we can set up a call. But what I can say based on what you're sharing right now is that let me just reread it really quick. We were surprised. Oops, just lost the chat. Where did it go? Your half the kilowatt hours used. Yeah, so there are a lot of factors that could be playing into that. It could be the age of the panels. It could be if they're 10 years old, there's a chance that the electricity demand of that particular home has actually increased since the time that they were installed. So in theory, like when they were installed, they could have been set to offset 100% of the usage. But as the electricity consumption has grown over time, the panels are no longer keeping up with that demand. Could also be other things like, I don't know if shading is a factor or placement is a factor. It could also be worth looking into anything that might be going on with the system that needs to be addressed. But again, those sorts of extra questions we're happy to dig into with you, but they'll take a little bit more time. So thank you, Emma, for putting that back in the chat. And thank you, Eric. Any other questions here? Perfect. Thank you, Dwayne. All right. Seeing no more questions, I'm happy to give you all back 12 minutes of your evening. So thank you all so much for being here. If you do want to hang on and have another question, feel free to do so. But otherwise, hope to see you all in September.